It seemed to like happen in slow motion, but it in reality, it happened in a span of like 10 minutes as we were grabbing stuff and people and getting them to higher ground. And in that 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, the water went from being at people's doorsteps to shin deep. So we're talking 2 or 3 feet. And then all of a sudden, it was like 5 feet deep.
Okay, go ahead and introduce yourself.
My name is Rosa Ledesma, and I work for the City of Kerrville Parks and Recreation Department. In my role as an assistant director with the Parks and Recreation Department, the morning of July 4th was a very interesting morning for me. We were, and I'm going to kind of talk about July 3rd, because we were preparing for the 4th of July event in Louise Hayes Park, which is a community staple. We were so excited for the event. And from a park's capacity, we don't really do much other than open up the park, make sure the grass is cut and there's toilet paper in the bathrooms and things like that. But it's just great to see the community come out for something like that. So we were really eager for this event. We were preparing for what was going to be a really great weekend. And so the morning of July 4th, for me, that kind of started at about 5 a.m. By chance, my brother is a police officer with Kerrville Police Department, and he was the sergeant on duty that night. And so at about 5 a.m., I received some phone calls from him. And then very shortly after, I actually received some phone calls from my dad. And I had longer conversations with my dad, but essentially they live on Arcadia Loop. And at that time, I mean, it was before 5:30. They were evacuating that entire road, which my parents are lucky that they live on the high side of Arcadia Loop. They're not right on the river, but there's a lot of elderly folk on that road. And so for them, or for my dad, he was at that time checking in on people, making sure that they were doing okay or evacuating, because the water was rising and it was rising pretty high. And I remember talking to him, and it was already really distorted because you can hear the rain, you can hear the people rustling in the background on the phone, you can hear the urgency in his voice. And all I remember was him saying, "It's bad, and you got to get up and you got to go do what you got to do, but it's bad and you got to go do it now." And for me, that was just, I don't think at that time I knew what that meant, but it definitely left an impression, because we've lived there since 99, and we've never had an instance where they're evacuating that entire street. Bear Creek is flooded. We've seen the water come over the low water crossing there many, many times, but we've, never been to the point where, my dad's like, they have the Bearcat out here, the sheriffs are out here, they're telling people to leave, like, you have to go. And so for me, that was kind of like my first instance of being like, okay, like this has the potential to be something, right? And again, I didn't know what it was, but I knew it had the potential to be something. And so I remember hanging up that phone call and just telling my dad to be safe, don't be a hero. Make sure that the neighbors are taken care of, make sure he's taken care of, and to call me with updates. And I hung up that phone call, immediately got a phone call from my supervisor, and it was the same kind of report. It was, where are you at? This is what's going on. This has the potential to be really bad. I need you to report or go do assessments. And I was like, okay, I'm on it. And so getting that call I got the calls from my brother, I got the calls from my dad, I got the calls from my supervisor in the span of like 30 minutes. All of that was leading up to, okay, I know this is bad, I don't know how bad, but I gotta go. And I remember crawling out of bed and throwing some clothes on. And luckily I live 5 minutes from the park. So I was like, I think I have time to brush my teeth and get there. I'll get there in enough time. It couldn't be that bad. And so I remember, having this sense of urgency, but, not even then, not really understanding how bad it was. And so I rolled out of my house, rolled down the road. Again, I only live like 5 minutes from Kerr Park. So it didn't take me long to get there. And I was probably there a little bit before 6 a.m. And the first thing I remember doing was going to my office, which is in Kerr Park. And I opened the door and all I hear are beeping. It's the alarms beeping at me, the computers are beeping in all the different offices. And for me, that was like, whoa, the power's out. That's kind of big because, it's not often that the entire power to our office gets knocked out. And we're kind of closer to Bandera Highway. So we're not even really near the river. And so for me, I was kind of like, that's weird that the power's out, but I, chalked it up to being the storm. And I remember trying to like mess with it because everything was beeping and everything was loud. The alarms were going off. And I just remember being like, I don't have time to mess with the alarms. I'm going to grab the keys to my vehicle and I'm going to go do my assessments so I can report back to my supervisor about what's happening. And so I remember grabbing the keys, leaving the office with all the alarms going off and just being like, that's a problem for later. And so I drove down to Kerr Park. Is split into two sides. There's a hillside and a riverside. It's a 517 acre park. So most of the park acreage is on the hillside. But the riverside is the most used side of the park because of the river access. And so it being 4th of July weekend, 4th of July on a Friday, we had the entire riverside booked to campers and people staying in cabins and RV sites and things like that. And so it was going to be a pretty busy weekend for our park. And so I remember going downhill and kind of hoping to run into people down to the riverside, hoping to run into people and just kind of be like, hey, it's raining. Are you guys okay? And I was not expecting what I actually saw when I drove down to the riverside. And it was dark still. I mean, it was at that point, maybe 6 a.m. And so, there was a little bit of daylight, but it was that kind of, dark blue light that you see, and it was so cloudy and it was still raining. And so there was no true, sunrise. It was just this kind of like dusty blue morning all morning. And so it was dark, and I remember driving down, watching the headlights of the truck hit this kind of tree line. And you can either go left or you can go right. Right takes you to our RV sites, our mini cabin sites, tent sites, rec hall, things like that. And if you go left, it drives down a little ways and goes straight to our riverfront access. We call it the beachfront. And so I remember following the headlights and trying to go left to go down to the riverfront to see how high the river had gotten. And I immediately was greeted with caution tape and barriers and debris and water. And so for me, part of me was relieved because seeing the barriers and the caution tape told me that my team, the park maintenance folks who attend to Kerr Park specifically, they had already gone down there and preemptively blocked off those areas. Was it pretty? No, it was just kind of caution tape, strung up between trees and poles and signs and things like that. But that told me, okay, they've already been here. They've already blocked off that area. Nobody can go down there and get trapped or stuck or whatever. But it was after that, kind of that immediate feeling of relief. I remember feeling a little bit scared because from that point down to the beachfront, it was maybe 20 feet, right? Of, going from where the river normally is to where it was 20 feet. And so seeing it come up that high already at 6 a.m. was like crazy. And I remember thinking, that's pretty high. There's no way it could possibly rise anymore. But at least they've got it blocked off. Nobody's going to go down there. And nobody's down there. And, we've done what we can to ensure that that side of the park is secure and nobody gets hurt down there. And I was worried that vehicles were gonna, because it kind of loops around the campsites. And so it would be easy for someone to loop around, not really see barriers or caution tape, and just drive down. And so I remember thinking, just as an extra barrier, I'm going to park my truck kind of at the entrance down to the beachfront. And I'm going to leave it there with the hazards on. Nobody's going to try to go past the truck. And it's just that extra level of safety. And so I kind of angled my truck at the entrance to the beachfront. And again, in my mind, I'm like, surely it's not going to rise anymore. Like, this is probably as high as it's going to get. My truck will be fine. And I'm going to go check on guests. And so I jumped out of my vehicle, and I remember walking past the rec hall towards our RV and mini cabins, and looking towards the river. And you right in front of the rec hall, there's an amphitheater, and it has just this really open view of the river. And so I remember getting to that open view and looking out the river, and it was rushing, and it was brown, and it was the trees crackling, and it was all of it. And I remember thinking, wow, like, this is a flood. This is a flood. And again, but in the back of my mind, I'm like, that's pretty high. There's no way it's going to go any higher. Like, that's probably as much as we'll get, but this is definitely something this is a force. This water is a force. And I continued walking down to the mini cabins, and luckily, like I mentioned earlier, I had staff on site, Dalen Ashing and Alex Benitez. They had showed up maybe 10 minutes earlier than I did. And the time that I was probably messing with the alarms in the office, like, they had already gone down there and put up that caution tape and those barriers and stuff. And so they were on site, and I remember feeling relieved that, okay, I'm not in this alone. My team's got it. With a little bit of direction, we'll make sure everyone's safe. We'll get everyone evacuated if we needed, and things like that. And so walked up to them. I was chatting with them very quickly about what's the report, what's the status report, what's happening, is everyone okay? And everyone was good. And we had started the process of evacuating the mini cabins. And there's 8 mini cabins right along the river. Again, they're kind of up on an embankment, but when I say embankment, I really mean like a hill. Because again, from where the river normally is to where those mini cabins are, it's probably 20, 30 feet. And so by that point, the mini cabins had water kind of at their doorstep. And so I'm like, okay, let's get these folks out, even though the water hasn't breached the cabins themselves, just out of precaution. Like, let's make sure that all these folks get their stuff out. Let's give them a place to stay. We had opened up some other facilities. Let's just make sure our folks are taken care of. And we did that, right? We got people out, and we were checking on all the different 8 cabins, and some of them, one of the cabins, it was just this one man, and he had all his medications and medical supplies, and he had all this stuff that he couldn't move by himself that quickly. And so I remember the park staff going and helping him grab as much stuff as they could and get to higher ground. And it seemed to happen. It seemed to like happen in slow motion, but in reality, it happened in a span of like 10 minutes as we were grabbing stuff and people and getting them to higher ground. And in that 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, the water went from being at people's doorsteps to shin deep. So we're talking 2 or 3 feet. And then all of a sudden, it was like 5 feet deep. And again, for me, I was like, it felt like it took an hour. But looking back at photos and just conversations with, the people that were there, it was 10, 15 minutes. And even experiencing that, I think just being there, it didn't even occur to me that the water was rising that fast. And not only was it rising that fast, but it was continuing to rise. And at that point, I think once we saw that the water was getting that high in the mini cabins, we were kind of like, we've got to get everyone out of this area of the park. Because right next to the mini cabins, there's 50 amp RV sites. And the water, it had risen that high in the cabins. And so it started to go over the roads where the RV loops were. And so we assessed, and we were kind of like, we need to get these folks out, even though it's not that high. We need to get these folks out. And I think, again, I kind of reassured myself that it's not going to get any higher than this. There's no way. There's no way it's going to get any higher than, road level. This is probably as high as it's going to get. But out of precaution, we were like, let's evacuate the RV loop sites. And in the time it took me, so I went to my first RV, and it's 6 a.m, 6:30 now, maybe. And you're banging on someone's RV door. And they're, you have to think, I'm putting myself in their shoes, and they're probably like, who is this banging on my door? I'm in a park. It's the 4th of July. I'm trying to sleep. Who has anything good to say at 6 o'clock in the morning? And I just remember banging on the door, hi, screaming, it's Rosa with the Parks Department. Can you come to the door? And you can hear people, rumbling around, scrounging around through things in their RV. And sure enough, eventually they would come to the door. But I remember having the conversation with the first person in the first RV I went to, and I was like, hi, sorry to wake you up. It's raining, as you can tell. The water has risen pretty significantly, and we're probably going to evacuate you. You have anywhere from 30 minutes to 45 minutes. And they were like, oh, are you sure we have to leave? And we were like, yeah, it's time, right? Just, you got a few minutes, you got 30, 40 minutes. But yeah, start packing stuff up and taking what you need and getting ready to move out. And, most of the time, they're just happy to have the notice. They were like, okay, if you say so. And I think we were very lucky and fortunate that the folks who were staying with us were that understanding. I feel like any other person would have been like, oh, we'll just wait it out. Or it can't be that bad. Like, we're pretty high up. It'll be fine. And so I think we were very fortunate that everyone who we spoke to that morning was really understanding. And they were like, if that's what you're recommending, we'll listen to you. You're the expert. You know this park better. And so I do think we were lucky to have such understanding folks staying with us that day. But I spoke to my first RV, and then I was walking to the second RV. And again, in the back of my mind, I'm like, there's no way the water's going to reach up this high, but, out of precaution, just to be safe. We're moving everyone. And I remember thinking that walking to my second RV, and as I'm walking to my second RV, which is a little bit closer to the river, I I realize I'm no longer walking in water. I am wading through water. It's no longer at my ankles. It's at my shin. It's at my knee in some areas. And I remember looking across at the RV, the rest of the RV loop, and I start to see dumpsters, and we have those big blue dumpsters. I remember looking across and seeing those big blue dumpsters floating across the RV loops. And I think that was another one of those moments where I was like, this is, I already knew it was bad, but this is worse. And I think that's when I kind of felt afraid that it was going to continue to get worse. And so, yeah, seeing that blue dumpster floating, and walking in shin to knee high water, definitely put some urgency in my thoughts, in my speaking, and in my approach with my second RV. Because at my second RV, I didn't wait for them to come to the door. I was banging on the door, and I was like, you gotta go, and you gotta go now. And again, you could hear them, moving things around inside their RV, and I'm like, you gotta go, and you gotta go now. Like, you've gotta, and from the moment I knocked to the moment they actually answered the door, I was, you gotta go, and you gotta go right now. It's not safe. Grab what you need and get to higher ground. And I remember thinking, like, I got to go back to that first RV and tell them that they don't have 30 minutes anymore. That they just need to grab what they can, and they need to get out of there. And I think that, in the conversations I had with my staff, like, they all felt that, and almost at the same time, but at different times. Because there was definitely a point where it was like, yeah, you've got a little bit of time, pack up your things and then start heading out. And then all of a sudden it was, you got to go now. And again, luckily everyone was willing to leave. We didn't have anyone fight us. Everyone trusted our judgment, and we were grateful for that. But then we kind of ran into the issue because the roads started to flood. How do we, now that everyone's packed up and ready to go, how do we get them out? Because there was only one access road to that loop, and that road was probably 4 feet underwater. And so staff, we made the executive decision. We have a neighboring loop, which is separated by some rocks and a very thin tree line. But we had to move these, and I say rocks, they're probably, 4 feet around, boulders, small boulders. And the maintenance guys were out there moving those rocks. They were pushing them by hand, and just to clear an exit point, just to clear an area for RVers to get their vehicles out. And we had, at that point, we had a few tent campers who, like, they hadn't even been evacuated yet. And so I remember running to the tent campers and being kind of like, you've got to go. And we've got a facility on the other side of the park, but, grab what you need. Don't grab everything, but grab what you need and get to higher ground. And so it was just all of it at once. I felt like it was the mini cabins, it was the RVs, it was the tent campers. We were just at that point scrambling to get everyone to higher ground. And in all of that, I remember thinking about my city vehicle, which I had left parked at the entry to the beachfront. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm a fool, because I told myself, it's not going to get any higher than this. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. And, and I remember being like, my truck is probably underwater, and freaking out and being like, okay, I got to go maybe save my truck. And I remember leaving, I think we had maybe 2 or 3 RVers who still hadn't gotten their vehicle out. They were packed up and on their way out, but they hadn't gotten their vehicles out. And so I remember leaving them in the very capable hands of, the other park maintenance staff and going to check on my vehicle. And luckily it wasn't underwater, but it was, the tires were in standing water. And so I remember moving it out of the way to a point which I thought was now the new safe. But I remember after moving my vehicle, walking back and really taking in everything that we had just done and everything that we just experienced, and looking at the flooding, from a far point of view, right? And I'm like, just an onlooker now, watching my park maintenance staff move and the vehicles and the water. And so, but I remember looking and being like, I'm glad everyone's safe here, but if it's this bad here, how terrible must it be in other areas along the river corridor? And I remember just like praying in my head that, nobody's hurt, everyone's okay. Like, I just hope everyone's okay. And I remember going to that same area in front of the rec hall above the amphitheater where you have that really open view of the river. And I remember standing there and looking at it, thinking again, hoping that everyone along the river corridor is safe. Not really knowing what the conditions were in other areas of the park or the city or the county. And I just remember being, I hope everyone's okay. Hope everyone's okay. And as I'm saying that in my head, I'm looking at the river and I start to see, I see a vehicle with its lights on and pass me. Like, I'm standing in the road and at a place where there's not a road and you're 20 feet up from the river, and I just see this vehicle pass by. And I remember that was kind of the third instance where I was like, this is really bad. This is really, really bad if I'm seeing cars floating by, especially in that section of the river, because there's nothing nearby. There's no low water crossings. There's the Loop 534 bridge, which is 30 feet up, and the closest low water crossing is G Street, and that is miles from where I'm at. And so it was, that was the third instance of this is pretty bad. And everything that I had just experienced in Kerrville Shriner Park was just one very, very small piece of what was actually happening out there. And so at that point, all the guests in Kerrville Shriner Park that had checked in that night before were evacuated, accounted for, and safe. And I remember just being relieved that everyone was good. Nobody lost. Nobody's RV got flooded. I just remember being grateful that everyone was safe. Property was safe. I mean, the riverfront was flooded and the mini cabins were flooded, but those are things that can be replaced. And so I just remember being glad that everyone was safe and that the park was okay. And I had, at that point, given an update to my supervisor and spoken to some of my coworkers about conditions of other parks in other areas, or in other areas along the river corridor. And now that Kerrville Shriner Park had been secured, I was going to go and assist in the assessment or damage assessments of some of the other parks. And so I left that park, and I remember I left that park and I went to, on my way out, I stopped at the Kerrville Shriner Park trailhead of the river trail. because I wanted to make sure nobody was down there. People like to run the river trail early in the morning. I don't know why, it could never be me. But I just wanted to go make sure nobody was down there, make sure that that site was secure, and that we didn't have to worry about anyone being trapped in the vehicle or trapped on the trail. And I drove down to the trailhead, and I was immediately greeted with down power lines and a down power pole and fencing and debris and water. And I was like, okay, nobody's in there. I gotta get out of here. I'm not trying to put myself in a dangerous situation. And then I found a little comic relief in, like, that's probably why the alarms in the office were beeping at me, is because this power pole is down. And then I had from that area a really good view of the Loop 534 bridge, which I mentioned earlier is it's a tall bridge, maybe 30 feet up. Don't quote me on that, but it's a tall bridge. And the water was lapping the bottom of the bridge. And the debris was getting caught on it. And I remember just thinking, like, I've never seen the water that high before. That's a very tall bridge. And being, again, just it was settling in that, like, this is bad. And I was taking it all in at that point. And I left that area and I was driving to Louise Hayes Park on 173, so Bandera Highway, and you pass River Hills and you pass kind of this open section of river corridor, and our river trail runs along that section. And I remember looking out and just seeing water in places where you didn't ever see water. And I remember seeing trees floating by and debris, and you could hear the crackling of trees breaking and trees floating in the water and cracking, and it was just a very eerie kind of sound, because I've heard it before with different floods, but it was just on a different scale this time. And I remember driving to Louise Hayes Park, having that view all the way to town, and just, preparing for the worst in Louise Hayes Park. And I got to Louise Hayes Park and it's underwater. I couldn't even go in the park, which was good because nobody should have been in that park. They had already evacuated it and closed the gates and locked it up, which was great. But I remember getting to the park and walking over, and just, again, the roaring of the water, the crackling of the trees, the roof of what we call Centennial Stage, which is the big open air stage in the middle of our event field, was usually in previous floods or flooding instances, you could still see the roof of that structure. But I remember walking up and not seeing it at all. And I remember thinking, is the water that high that I just can't see that roof structure, or is the roof structure gone? And my coworker had confirmed that they saw it float away. And that was, again, just for me, very mind-boggling, because we've had floods before and the structure's been fine. We've had floods before and the water's gotten high, but it's never taken any infrastructure out like that. And so for me, hearing that was mind-boggling, and it was just, again, another confirmation of how bad the flood really was. And when I show up, we're assessing, do we still have power on? Do we still have water on? Things like that with staff, or there are things that we can save, right? Or at least move to higher ground. we had, because we were going to have an event the day before, we had equipment like gaiters and trailers with event supplies in it. And so stuff like that it was underwater, but can we move it to higher ground so it's not standing in water and it's somewhat safer, and there's a potential to salvage whatever we can. And so that was kind of what I showed up to Louise Hayes Park. That was the mentality that I showed up to Louise Hayes Park with. Was, what can we save? What do we need to turn off? What power, water, what infrastructure can we try to save? And what do we know is a total loss? And I remember just with all the other park maintenance staff that had shown up, just getting to work and moving gaiters and moving trailers and moving barriers and securing the park. Because even though PD and fire had come through and locked the gates, at that point there's daylight. And so there were a lot of people who just wanted to see it. And rightfully so, because it was, definitely a moment of awe. But it wasn't safe. And so a lot of people, I think that they, like I had done, similarly that early morning, like I knew it was bad, but I didn't have an understanding of how bad it was. And so I think a lot of people showed up to take pictures and to just look, not really understanding that it was an ongoing emergency situation. And it was pouring rain all morning. I think by the time I had gotten to Louise Hayes Park, I was soaking wet. My hat was wet, my rain jacket was wet. My socks were wet, and it was an ongoing situation. It was still pouring rain, and the water was still rising, and it wasn't receding as quickly as people thought it was. And I just remember thinking that people don't understand that this is still a safety concern. And so we were saving equipment, we were securing the park, we were asking people to leave. There was just so much to do. And I remember just hitting the ground running, doing anything and everything that I could to help alongside my staff. And it was definitely a team effort that morning, both in KSP in Kerrville-Shiner Park and in Louise Hayes Park, because everyone on the parks maintenance team just showed up and went to work and got things done. And it was really, we always work well as a team, but it was really great to see that camaraderie and just go get it done attitude from everyone that morning. And also just give support to like PD and other first responders that had showed up on scene, and things like that. But it was a busy morning. And I remember there being a moment where I could kind of take a breath. And I don't want to say relax, because I feel like I was on edge for that entire week, but just take a step back in Louise Hayes Park and really, again, assess what was happening, or comprehend, really. And I remember thinking, I hope the brand new playground that we put in Guadalupe Park is okay. And maybe that's a little bit selfish of me to say, but as a parks person who was very proud to see that project completed, I just remember being like, fingers crossed, it's safe. And in that moment, it was really funny, kind of sad, but in that moment, I was looking out at the river, at all the debris washing by, and I saw this bright blue plastic piece. And I remember talking to my coworker and asking him to look at it and be like, do you see that way out there? And he was like, yeah, I see that. And I was like, please tell me that's not the blue slide from Guadalupe Park. And he was like, that's the blue slide from Guadalupe Park. And I was defeated. I was defeated in that moment because I knew that that park and that structure, that playground structure, didn't make it. Another one of those moments where this is bad and it's going to take a long time for us to recover. And it was a very surreal moment. Yeah. I think between wading through the water and seeing the vehicles float away in the river and seeing the slide wash by, it was just all so surreal and wild to think about. And I remember thinking in that moment after seeing the blue slide get washed away, being in Louise Hayes Park on the hill and looking down at Loopy, the bass sculpture, and just being proud that it was still there. And I had my fingers crossed so tight. I was like, please don't wash away Loopy. But just being proud that it was there. And in that moment, I had saw the blue slide get washed away, and feeling defeated, looking at Loopy kind of did the opposite of that. And I was like, you know what? It doesn't matter because we'll come back and we'll be stronger than ever, which sounds really cliche to say, but it was good to kind of have Loopy as our, our flag still standing kind of moment. Yeah. And then I think shortly after that, for me at least, still in Louise Hayes Park, and the water had started to recede and the rain finally started to let up, and it was just a moment of relief. And it was still raining, but I mean, we had a little bit more daylight, and I think that's when I feel like in that moment of relief, that's when we started to get the reports of people missing. And that very brief moment of relief was kind of like the last moment of relief I had felt for that entire week. Because I think once we started to get the reports of people missing, that's when it set in that like it wasn't just damaged infrastructure or vehicles. There are people who are missing, and gears switched a little bit. We're a little less worried about our infrastructure and more about what can we do to support. As park staff, we're not first responders, but we're responders, and we're there when you need us. And so, yeah, we were, I think, after that initial day, because that initial day was just a lot of assessing and reporting damage and making sure the areas were secure. But after that initial day, it was, what can we do to support? Is that us going and looking for water line breaks? Is that us going through debris? Is that us making signs to put up to warn people of hazards, And so, yeah, it was, that day was kind of the start, that moment was the start of what was a really long month for not just me, not just my friends or my coworkers, but I mean our community. It is something that I think will stick with us for a very long time.
How many people do you think, or how many RVs and tent setups were there at the Shriner Park?
We had 8 mini cabins with 8 families in those mini cabins. And the RV loop in Kerrville Shriner Park that we had to evacuate had 10 sites. And I think that there, if I remember correctly, 8 RVers or RVs in those sites. Some of those, there was a whole family in one of the mini cabins. There was like 6 or 8 people. And one of the RVs, it was one gentleman, but in the other ones, they had, like 6 people with them as well. And so hard to put a number to it, but yeah, somewhere between, for sure, 8 mini cabins and then 8 mini cabins and then the 8 RV sites. And then we had 3 folks in tent sites, 3 different tent site families, if that makes sense. So the park was full. Some people we had found out later, they had, because the storm, it was storming all night long from the 3rd through the 4th. And so we had folks who that was something that was scary, was we had folks that had checked in and just through the rain, through the night, they up and left because they were like, we don't want to ride this out, right? So they left. And so that morning it was kind of scary to be like, okay, we were supposed to have these people here and then they're not here. And we did a lot of scrambling with phone calls and things like that. And luckily everyone was accounted for, but it was kind of frightening at first to be like, we're supposed to have people here, but they're not here. Where'd they go? And luckily everyone was accounted for though. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Anything else to add or?
No, I don't think so.
Thank you very much for doing this, Rosa. We appreciate it. This helps out. Thank you.